night of the dawn and oh.
Strong southerly winds will be widespread over Great Britain.
Previously on the British Broadcasting Century podcast. Last episode we brought you the landmark tale of how King George V was recorded, live from Wembley's Empire Exhibition on April the 23rd, 1924. It's the only recording of the BBC in the 1920s, and it was made off-air by the husband of Mrs Dorothy Jones in Croydon. So what else of the early BBC was recorded off-air? This time we move forward just a few years to 1932, where Mr F.O. Brown of Edinburgh had some home kit himself, an Echo radio recorder. Decades later, his grandson found these recordings there in the attic of the family home and painstakingly took them off those metal discs and put them onto the internet.
You will now hear the Prince of Wales speaking at the opening of the New Shakespeare Memorial Theatre at Stratford-on-Avon on 23rd April 1932.
And he would have rejoiced to know that there's a workshop for the production of it. Southerly winds will be widespread over Great Britain.
Greenbankrecords.com is where they are housed today. And you can go there, greenbank-records.com, to not only hear the recordings, but read all about F.O. Brown's amazing tale of recording these at home from 1932 to 1937. From George V to George VI via Stanley Baldwin, George Bernard Shaw, and music from Henry Hall and the BBC Dance Orchestra. There are dozens of recordings that Alex has preserved, made by his grandfather, F.O. Brown. I spoke to Alex, and he's given kind permission that we can hear some of those marvellous recordings. This is episode 86, The Tale of Greenbank Records, here on the British Broadcasting Century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling. This is London Calling.
Hello, not just London calling, but London calling Edinburgh in the 1930s on this occasion. I'm Paul Carenza. Thank you for joining us for another episode of your favourite podcast that retells the origin story of British broadcasting incredibly slowly. As far as I'm aware, we're the only podcast to do that. Well, someone has to. All right, someone didn't have to, but we are. While in our timeline we're in 1923 telling the tale of the very early BBC, we leapt forward last episode to 1924.
For the purpose of opening the British Empire Exhibition.
Because it was the centenary of George V, the first monarch on the radio and the first recording of the BBC. So while we're thinking of that, I just thought we'd leap forward just a few years to 1932, which is the only other instance that I know of in the interwar years of off-air recording. That is, people at home listening to the radio and working out how to record it. The BBC didn't record anything until 1932 when they got a Blattner-phone, a recording device, so they could record not a lot, but just a few choice broadcasts.
One of the obstacles is the burden of taxation. The country has decided once and for all that the budget must be balanced.
These were normally either royalty or ministers, because it's the same time that the Empire Service came in. So that means that they could get in some dignitary to give a speech, record it, and then repeat it for those across the world, in Australia, for example, so they didn't have to invite said dignitaries back in again at ungodly hours.
This is London Calling. London calling the Australasian zone.
So with no real effort to record or archive anything in these early days, off-air recordings are golden, really.
Now, here is a really valuable souvenir, a record spoken by no other than George Bernard Shaw on 11th July 1932. He is speaking on his career. One moment, please.
So I will not waste your time by telling you.
With the tale of how his grandfather recorded these, and indeed then the painstaking effort to get them off these metal discs and back onto the internet for us to enjoy now, I spoke to Alex from Greenbank Records. Delighted to welcome to the podcast now someone who has a corner of the internet which I was particularly fascinated. Alex from Greenbank Records. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure, Paul. Thank you.
You've got a fascinating website. Could you explain to us what it is, how it came about, and the incredible role that your grandfather played in making this happen?
Yeah, so how it came about. So back in 2016, my father asked me to clear out the loft of his house because he could no longer access it. And on going up to the loft, I discovered a number of records that my grandfather owned and had just been handed over to my parents on my grandfather's death, and they hadn't really looked at what was in there. So there are a number of boxes, many of which contained normal vinyl records, some of them old 78 shellac records, but among the collection was a number of very strange metal records, which completely baffled myself, my parents too, who had no memory of them, bearing in mind that my mother wasn't born till well after the war, and these records preceded that. I'm talking about the Second World War. Yes. So these metal records, for a while, they just sat in my house because I had no idea what to do with them. I thought about taking them down to the British Sound Library, which is based in Pancras in London. But then I had images of me turning up with plastic bags full of records and being met with a degree of skepticism at the door. So I didn't go down that route. And I didn't know what was on them and whether it was reliable. What I discovered through my researches on the internet were that they were effectively home recordings. They were recordings my grandfather had made, in some cases off the radio, broadcasts. In other cases, they were recordings he'd made with the use of microphone. Again, I was a bit dubious about handing them over to someone else to recover because of the fact that they contained things he'd said. So I went about trying to recover them myself, which involved more research. Ultimately, to cut a long story short, involved me having to buy some specialist equipment, some specific styluses, and work out a way of playing them, because they were originally designed to be played with fiber soft needles, and any use of a hard jeweled stylus would likely destroy them. And in addition to that, you needed a special shape of stylus. Ultimately, I was able to recover sounds, in some cases with the aid of some lubricant. They're not grooved in the sense that materials removed from the record. They are grooved in the sense that they are just embossed with a recording needle, and that creates a kind of ridged structure, which is very difficult to play back. But I persevered, ultimately managed to stitch samples together into coherent recordings for each disc. And then I decided to create a website because for three reasons, really. One was I felt it was a bit of a tribute or an in memoriam to my grandfather, who exhibited so much patience and care in creating these records. Another aspect was I thought that, it would be of general interest to the public at large for entertainment value, research, education. And also I found the period itself really fascinating, which you obviously have done too. This development of this new technologies, their social impact, and the whole period seems to be populated with some great characters.
Absolutely.
Like Reginald Foort and his gigantic organ.
There is Reginald Foort at the BBC Theatre.
In true Desert Island Discs style, maybe we should intercut with some music throughout. So, to introduce the first record, we've got, there's so many here we could play a little bit of. We won't play all of the record because I think it's important we send people to your site and they can see that there are loads there, a good couple of dozen. I think the earliest is early 1932. Is that fair to say? Spring of 1932?
A lot of them were produced in 1932, which I don't think is a coincidence, because he got married the next year, and I don't think he potentially had as much opportunity to make this record.
Fair enough. Well, how about we have a bit of Henry Hall and his dance orchestra then? We'll hear a little bit of this. And for the full record, they can go to greenbank-records.com. Henry Hall and his BBC Dance Orchestra, shall we?
Take it away.
Henry Hall BBC Dance Orchestra will play snuggled on your shoulder. 16th June 1932.
Your grandfather introducing Henry Hall and giving the date as well, which was marvellous.
He was very meticulous about giving dates and where the broadcast was and other details. I think he fancied himself as a bit of a DJ, an amateur DJ.
Well, you hear, I mean, I know when I was a child, I was there with a cassette player and recording my little radio station. And then my kids now, well, my son is 12, when he was 9 or 10, he was there he found the website of the Radio 2 jingles and he's recording himself on a digital device doing the same thing. And there you go, in 1932, your grandfather is doing the same. Home, amateur, DJ, just doing it domestically. Beautiful.
Yeah, and sometimes he had the habit of interrupting otherwise serious news broadcasts with his own asides, which was perhaps not quite as professional.
Title that tune was Snuggled on Your Shoulder. Before that it says Wooden Soldier and China Doll. The next tune comes from the new film, Miss Maurice Chevalier with the star. The film is called 1 Hour With You. The tune is called What Would You Do?
Stanley Baldwin announcing Great Depression measure.
Yeah, so not all the broadcasts are fun and frivolous like the Henry Hall dance bands and other dance band recordings. He recorded some broadcasts of perhaps national interest and import, and one of them is Stanley Baldwin announcing a Great Depression measure, which was a spot of larceny on the part of the government at the time. War bonds had been sold to the public back in the period of the First World War with a certain term, 30-year term, and a certain annual rate of return. And come period of the Great Depression, this was costing the government a lot of money to maintain. At the same time, I think they probably wanted to raise a war chest for forthcoming potential conflicts in Europe. So rather than maintain the war bonds at the existing term and annual rate, they decided to convert them on a much reduced rate of return and over a perpetual term. If it ultimately paid off, they would be worth a lot less against inflation.
This is Tesco club card points all over again. Times 3 becomes times 2. We know what's happening. Yeah.
And so you got the machinations there of the Chancellor at the time, Stanley Baldwin, who's selling it as a kind of patriotic initiative.
Yeah, okay.
But my grandfather was a bit more wise and realised this was hit him in the pocket, and that's why he introduces it as such an important broadcast.
Excellent.
Although it bore most people's socks off, you know.
Yeah, no, well, it's good to hear a bit, so let's have some of that.
On 1st July 1932, Mr. Stanley Baldwin made a statement in the House regarding the scheme for conversion of 5% war loan, one of the largest financial operations of its kind ever undertaken. Here is Mr. Stanley Baldwin.
This is the 1st of July. It happened that quite apart from the war loan letter, it is one of the busiest days of the year for the post office. This year, they have to handle the war loan letter as well. If the postman is a little late tomorrow morning, or if a letter you had expected by the first post does not arrive till later, I am sure you will understand.
It's worth noting then, this is 1932, and the earliest BBC recordings in-house at the BBC was also 1932. So this is as early as any recording of the BBC gets. They had these Blattner phones they bought in, I think, 31, but they didn't start using until 1932. Your grandfather's there recording at the same time as the earliest possible BBC recordings.
You're quite right. They only started recording, I think, in order to take advantage of the shortwave radio broadcasts. They had to, I think, record in order to meet the various time zones on a broadcast over shortwave.
Yeah, the Empire service, not The
Empire service. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't think that started until September 1932.
And there's the other, I think it's in spring 1932 as well. That's when they moved out Savoy Hill into broadcasting house. So I know they used it as a bit of a one-off gimmick to think, how do we celebrate 10 years of a venue that we have no recordings of? So let's invite people back to record as if it was their original recording. So then they get Vita Sackville West.
When I first told my friends that I was going to Persia, I discovered that to most of them, Persia was little more than a vague romantic name.
The first radio vicar, Reverend John Mayo.
I have just come from my church in Whitechapel.
So they all came into the studio, recorded on their Blacknophone discs, and then it was played out as part of that. But speaking of Savoy Hill, so Savoy Hill closed using the recording device, and then Broadcasting House opened, and you have a recording of the first broadcast.
I do, yes.
From Broadcasting House under Henry Hall.
March, yes, absolutely.
Let's have a bit of that then. There aren't many of these, are there? Why aren't there more of these then? I don't know. Is it not a big thing that happened?
I've given this some thought. I think there are 4 or 5 challenges really to radio recording at the time. You would need to be geographically well located in order to pick up a reliable radio signal from the transmitters available at the time, acknowledging that the medium wave regional service hadn't been fully established. And also, you'd require a fairly reliable domestic supply of electricity. And that's no guarantee. Certainly in Scotland, I think the Central Electricity Board had only just been established, linking Glasgow, Edinburgh, maybe Perth. But outside of that, you're struggling. So that's the first factor, geography. Another is cost. So a decent valve set, which you require, you couldn't record off a crystal set. A decent valve set with an amplifier would be £1,000 in today's money, I think. Then you've got this specialist radio recording equipment, which in this case was made by Echo. That's about £500 in today's money. And then you've got the technical know-how, and I will give this some thought, but your average turntable, for example, would only be designed to play back rather than overcome the resistance of a recording instrument. So you'd probably have to modify the turntable motor and replace that. And then you're talking about driving a recording device off your valve set. Now, it's normally set up to drive a loudspeaker, so it requires more oomph to drive a physical recording needle to transcribe the signal into the material. So you're talking about transformer. Now, by the time you've assembled all this bits of kit, it's not an integrated hi-fi system. It's bits of stuff connected by wires. You've got a fair jumble, especially considering, coaxial cable, going in and out. And this is where I think the sympathetic domestic environment comes in, because you're going to have a fairly benign partner to accept this sort of situation where the living room's taken over with. Going to end up looking like Frankenstein's laboratory. So
we have a few listeners to this podcast I know who have got rooms in their houses that have been taken over by the modern day version of such kit.
And presumably they have sympathetic partners, but
maybe.
Yeah. Geography, cost, technical know-how, and domestic environment. I think that would narrow down your field of those who could do these recordings at the time.
And speaking of geography then, so whereabouts, what was your granddad? Where is this being recorded from?
So my grandfather was brought up very close to Edinburgh city centre and moved out to Greenbank, which is where the Greenbank Records name comes from. The suburb of Edinburgh, about 2 miles from the city centre. So he would be easily able to pick up, of course, the city transmitter and probably Glasgow as well. But I've got some evidence, and this is just anecdotal, that he built himself a radio mast in his garden.
Oh, wow.
Now, I recall as a child there being signs of some reinforcement in the back garden and a pollarded pole. And I had always assumed that was a telegraph pole. But speaking to my mother, she thinks that was a foundation for a mast he himself erected.
Wow.
And I think that would explain why he was able to pick up a long way from Daventry, because I've got evidence he was able to do that.
Okay.
And that is some distance. That's about 270 miles from Edinburgh.
God, yeah, it's incredible to think.
again, it narrows down, who's got the capacity to do all this.
Yeah.
Time, which I think makes them unique.
Well, and you mentioned about you got married the year after. I imagine your grandmother moving into this going, what's this in the back garden?
Yes.
What's going on here?
Yes, and there'd be wires coming in through the living room window. That's the only way you could unless you took the whole unit outside, and then there's the neighbours.
Indeed, I can only imagine. Well, speaking of Edinburgh, then this is surely the perfect time to introduce a non-BBC recording that he's done. The tour of Edinburgh. What's this all about?
Well, again, a bit of a mystery, but it seems that he had a habit of making his own recordings. This is not radio broadcasts, but making his own recordings on the basis of scripts that he wrote to be performed by him and his friends. And this is one example of that. I think this must have been prepared, and he assembled a group in his house, again, probably before he got married. And they performed this skit, a 2-minute skit on the tour of Edinburgh, which is tongue-in-cheek kind of tour. There are parts which he skips by somewhat disrespectfully, such as the National Museum, and lingers a bit heavily in I think it might be the lingerie department of one of the department stores in Princes Street. But in any case,
this is recorded at home then, obviously. This is not a walking tour. He's not driving around going, and now we pass on your left-hand side, because that would
no iPhones.
Imagine. No, exactly, yeah.
I think it was entirely visualised against the script. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, me and my friends 70 years later in the 90s, we were doing the same with cassette tapes and recording silly sketches and sending it to the BBC, and BBC replied and said, no, thank you. We can't say these words on the air. Delighted to know that long before the Goons, your grandfather's doing this, the tour of Edinburgh.
We tour around Edinburgh in 2 minutes. Our first rendezvous is, in this specially conducted tour, is Woolworth. We are now on the ground floor. On the ground floor, fine day today, fine day. Take that tap out of your mouth, Johnny. You never know who has had it before. No, madam. We do not sell suspenders separately. You must buy a pair. 6 please. We are now going to the Scottish Museum. That was the Scottish Museum. And now we go on to Tynecastle, that wonderful open-air playground where the boys have such fun at football, etc. Hooray! Hooray! Hello, the Hearts have scored a goal. Hooray! Foul, send him out. Give us a referee. Here is Buddy Victor. This was recorded on 21st November 1932.
We've talked on the podcast before about Peter Eckersley in 1922. 10 years before that tour of Edinburgh. There's that seems thing to go hand in hand. The engineer, the plucky British sort of spirit of just let's do the show right here, and that sense of frivolity and just having a laugh at it all at the same time.
I absolutely agree with that. There seems to be a spirit of modern progressiveness during the whole period, and frivolity, a bit of flippancy, which was unexpected to me, because I look back at my grandparents and think how serious they must have been. They had the Great Depression, they had the lead up to war. These were hard times, and the impression you get is one of solemnity, one of gravitas, and if you listen to the Royal broadcast, that comes across. But they seem to have a lot of fun. At least my grandparents did, despite the troubles. It's been great personally to see that, and I think you obviously get a lot of joy out of that too. Looking back at those times, that sense of fun. It's something you feel maybe has got a bit diluted recently. I don't know.
Peter Eckersley.
If only people would see their jobs, if only people would see their lives in terms of its humour, of its excitement, and that a job well done deserves laughter, and not the solemnity of the pompous administrator on top of it. If we could only see that the thing that we do is a God-given thing, for heaven's sake, because it's creative, and it's fun, and it's exciting, then I think all these certificates, all these rules, all these rather dull regulations might be seen to be unnecessary, besides people who are essentially poets, even though they be technicians.
There are similar echoes today with social media, increasing use of technology for broadcast. This time, everyone can broadcast. But that sense of amateur fun doesn't seem to be quite so much there. It's a bit more cynical.
Yeah, the early days of podcasting had a bit, and still, there are still podcasts that sees that as well. But it does seem to have, certainly since the pandemic, been taken over by, every celebrity chatting to every other celebrity, and a certain clinical nature to it maybe now. But if you can reclaim that spirit of joy to it, then it's no bad thing. So finally, then, let's have one last excerpt on this podcast, and then people can go to greenbank-records.com and hear the full works. I don't know how many there are. There looks like about 30 or 40 or something. The dates range 1932 into the late 30s. Moments of note, we've got things like the BBC narrative, The Abdication Crisis here. We've got the Christmas message from George V, various musical excerpts, George Bernard Shaw as well. But should we have your granddad's introduction of the Royal Command performance of 1932? That feels like a nice, grand moment to leave us on.
Here we have Jack Hilton and his band playing at the Royal Command performance in the London Palladium on 30th May 1932. One moment please, and I shall fade them in.
Huge thanks to Alex of Greenbank Records and his grandfather, F.O. Brown. Incredible to think that those metal discs were just lying there in the attic for decades until Alex happened to clean out the loft and discovered the lot. Hey, what could be lurking in your loft? I don't mean that in a terrifying way, but who knows what undiscovered gems are lying in the attics of the nation. I just hope that someone finds them before any sort of clear-out firms come in and just get rid of the lot. But there are gems still out there if only we knew where to look. For now, though, we are delighted that some of these very early broadcasts have been kept and preserved for future generations, and hopefully thanks to the internet and Alex's work, and indeed you supporting this podcast means that we get to continue telling this tale and archiving them in a way for future listeners. So thank you for listening and indeed supporting this. If you would like to support us financially, there is the patreon.com/Paul Carenza way of doing things. For £5 a month, you get videos and writings and extra behind-the-scenesy things, and the knowledge that you are keeping this podcast afloat. So thank you to the couple of dozen who do that for us on Patreon. Or, you know what? By sharing this podcast, by telling some friends about it, it just helps us grow. So that's really, really appreciated as well. You can rate and review us as well. We've got some lovely 5-star reviews. So if you fancy leaving us one of those and haven't already, wherever you found this podcast, give us a little rate. You hear a lot of podcasts say it, but as a solo run operation, without the PR budget of BBC Sounds or Goalhanger Productions or whatever they're called nowadays, I'm just really glad if even one person tells one other person about what we're doing here. So thank you. Now, we really need to get back to May of 1923 to continue that chronological tale, but I've got one more special next time, which is a little ahead of that, because it's the centenary of The Cello and the Nightingale, a wonderful tale from May 1924 of one of the first proper major outside broadcasts of nature. And what a wonderful tale it is too. If you've heard of anything of the early BBC, The Cello and the Nightingale is perhaps one of those that has resonated throughout the years. We'll be speaking to an expert on Beatrice Harrison and that wonderful tale of how a Surrey garden was brought to the airwaves year after year after year. That's next time, and this has been this time, so it's time to stop. The British Broadcasting Century is presented and produced by me, Paul Carenza. The original music is by Will Farmer. The audio you hear is so old it's generally speaking beyond copyright, but regardless, those who own it, and we doff our caps to them. We doff our caps to the British Broadcasting Company and Corporation for all they did and do to present and preserve these radio broadcasts, and we doff our cap especially this episode to Mr F.O. Brown of Greenbank. Head to greenbank-records.com for more details, more clips, and more of the wonderful story of this preservation of audio. We're here to inform, educate and entertain, and join us next time for The Cello and the Nightingale here on the British Broadcasting Century.